kind of get up close and personal. And we have the seats set out, spread out for you, but we'll start here in a couple minutes. Check.
Well, good evening, everyone. I appreciate all of you all coming out. You don't know who I am. My name is Braxton Hunter. I'm the president of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary right here in Evansville, Indiana at trinitysem.edu. And I'm also a one-lifer, and I used to go to the West Campus, but you'll have to forgive me that I no longer go to the West Campus. Now I'm at East, but I'm so excited about what's going to happen tonight as a one-lifer and as someone who's been blessed so much by the speaker that we have this evening. Our school has professors that are all over the United States, and we have students in 120 plus countries. And one of those professors, or at least visiting professors, is Steve Gregg. Several years ago, I found Steve online just looking for audio. I'm a Bible geek and a theology geek, and so I like to listen to stuff while I'm driving. Instead of music, I like to listen to lectures and sermons and things like that. And I found this man, and I just was blown away by his just incredible knowledge of the Word of God. He's taught through the entire Bible multiple times, verse by verse. And in fact, if you enjoy what you hear tonight, I encourage you to go to thenarrowpath.com, thenarrowpath.com, and you'll find their series, but you'll also find that entire verse by verse through the whole Bible. And so you can start getting into the Bible in a deeper way with Steve, like I did. I went through the whole thing. It probably took me 3 years, but it was just a great blessing. On top of that, he's a regular radio host, and you can listen online, and there's a link to that on his website. Every day, every weekday, I guess, he answers questions, Bible questions, questions about God and theology. And so it's just an amazing ability that he has to kind of extemporaneously just answer those questions. And he's also written a couple of books, one on the subject that he's going to be talking about tonight, Revelation, 4 Views. And you might be able to find it at the local bookstore. I think there's like one left in Evansville anyway. But you might be able to find it there at the Barnes & Noble, but you can certainly order it at Amazon. So that's Revelation, 4 Views. And then he has a new book. There's 2 volumes to the book, and one of those is already out. And that is called Empire of the Risen Sun. And you may think, well, I don't know who this guy is. Why do I want to read his book? But I think after tonight you will. So I'm excited to invite my friend and one of my personal heroes, Steve Gregg, to speak to you tonight.
Well, I'm humbled to be anyone's hero because I've never really felt very heroic, actually, or special. I have 5 children, and my youngest son works as an auto mechanic, and he's working at a particular shop where the owner of the shop happened to be someone who listened to my radio show. And when he heard that my son was my son, he said, "Wow, your dad's famous." And my son said, "He is?" He had no idea. I'm actually not. I'm not very famous, but I have been on the radio a long time in a few radio markets, about 30 nationwide, and we do have a website. In fact, some of you are here because you go to this church, and you're probably here on Wednesdays anyway. Others may be here because you knew of me through either the radio show or the website. How many are in the latter category? How many of you are here because you knew of me already? So we're not on the radio here in Evansville, so we don't have any locals. This brother here drove 200 miles on his motorcycle to come here. He's the only one who's familiar with me. So, but that might be a good advertisement. I don't know if it is or not. Yeah, my book, Revelation, 4 Views, I don't sell it. I don't carry it. I have only this copy with me here. We don't sell them in the back or anywhere else. You can't buy them from me from my website, but you can get them from Amazon and other places. It is a book I wrote in 1997 while I was still directing a Bible school, which I directed for 16 years. And every year I taught through the book of Revelation, among other books of the Bible. And I had been raised with only one particular view of Revelation that was taught to me from youth. And in my early ministry, I've been a Bible teacher for 50 years. This year makes 50 years. I started in 1970. And for the first 8 years or so of my ministry as an adult, I only knew of one view of Revelation. Then eventually I began to become exposed through books and such to other views. Eventually I was aware of 4 very distinct views of the book of Revelation, each of which had some merit. Each one had some scriptural support. Each one had certain weaknesses too, but it became clear to me that the view I had been taught was not necessarily the only one. In fact, the one I had been taught is the one that had arisen most recently in history of them all. The other 3 views had been around centuries longer, which made me think, why didn't I know about this? Why did I only know about the most novel and new view of Revelation that's only been around for less than 200 years, when the whole church age was a time of study and opinion about the book of Revelation, and it was seen very differently than I had been taught. So because I had to teach Revelation every year at my school, I looked for a book that would go through the book of Revelation verse by verse and would compare the different views side by side. rather than me having several stacks of books and having to open them all to the passage and see what each one said. And I actually was not interested in writing that book, not even a little bit. I'm not much of a writer. That is to say, I don't write very many books because I'm too busy and not very disciplined. It takes a lot of discipline to write a book. So I looked for a book that would compare the 4 views of Revelation in an objective manner without pushing one over the others. What I found, I actually read over 50 commentaries on Revelation, and some of them didn't even mention that there were 4 views, but many of them did mention in their introductions there are 4 views, and they would name them. They might even have a sentence or two telling what those views, how they looked at things. But then they'd just spend the rest of their commentary defending a particular view that was the author's. I thought I'd like to see a book that would make it unnecessary for people to read 50 commentaries in Revelation. They could get distilled into one, all the comments from all 4 views that were of any interest and that were helpful. And I looked for 10 years. I really wanted that book. And I looked for 10 years. This is before we had the internet and before there was Amazon. But there was, back then in those days, you could go to a bookstore and they could do a book search throughout the world of bookstores. And frankly, I did that for several years and couldn't find one. Eventually, I just broke down and thought, well, I guess I'll have to write one. And I spent 3 years writing this. And it came out in 1997. So that's this book. I've written some other books. We won't talk about those tonight. I just want to say about Revelation. Most people, when they hear that there are different views of Revelation, are not even aware of the categories in which these views differ. For example, when my friends knew I was writing a book on the 4 views of Revelation, sometimes they'd say, well, I can think of 3 views. There's like pre-trib and mid-trib and post-trib. But what's the other view? Or they'd say, I know of premillennialism and amillennialism and postmillennialism. I've heard of those. What's the 4th one? None of those have anything really to do with the categories of the 4 views of Revelation. The categories are much more radically different than those. For example, if you've heard that some people believe in a pre-tribulation rapture and other people in a mid-tribulation rapture and some in a post-tribulation rapture, you have to realize all of those are parts of one of the 4 views, one view. And that is the view that the book of Revelation is about the tribulation and the end of time. That's called the futurist view, the idea that Revelation has yet to be fulfilled in the future. Now, whether you believe the rapture is before, after, or in the middle of the tribulation is a subsidiary question that is debated among people who all hold the futurist view. But the other 3 views aren't futurists. They don't believe Revelation is about the future at all. They're also not lined up according to their views of the millennium. The word premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial all have something in common, and that's the word millennial. And that doesn't refer to a certain generation, the millennials. It refers to the generic meaning of the word millennium, which is 1,000 years. And some of us, most of us, are old enough to remember when actually the millennium turned over, and there's a big deal about, the year 2000, it's a new millennium. And that's true. But in the Bible, there is a reference to a millennium, a 1,000-year period of time, and the premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial views are different views about that millennium and its relationship to the second coming of Christ. For example, the premillennial view holds that Jesus will come before the millennium. Premillennial, they believe in a premillennial return of Christ. So Jesus will come in that view, and then there will be the millennial reign. The postmillennial view holds that Jesus will come after the millennium. There will be a post-millennial return. And therefore, there will be 1,000 years of peace and justice in the world, brought about, they think, by the preaching of the gospel and the conversion of the masses. And that world will be a peaceful and Christianized world for 1,000 years thereabouts. And then Jesus will come at the end of that. That's the post-millennial view. The amillennial view, the letter A before a word in Greek, although millennial is a Latin word, but in Greek, if you put the word a letter A before it, it negates it. Amillennial means no millennium. And this is the view that it does not deny that the Bible refers to 1,000 years, but it does not believe there's a literal 1,000-year period that's being referred to. That amillennial view holds that the binding of Satan at the beginning of the 1,000 years actually took place at the first coming of Christ. And that the second coming of Christ is found later in the chapter after the 1,000 years, after Satan has been loose for a little while. And in Revelation 20, verse 9, fire from heaven comes down and consumes Satan and his confederates. And that is seen by the amillennialists as the second coming of Christ, which Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 1:8, Christ will come in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who don't know God and who do not obey the gospel. So that's the amillennial view, that the millennium isn't really a literal 1,000 years. It's 1,000 is just symbolic for a long time. And that long time actually is not after Jesus comes back. And not necessarily just before he comes back, but rather it's the whole period of time between his first and second coming. Now those are the three views of the millennium. Those are not three views of Revelation, because the millennium, the 1,000 years, is mentioned in only one chapter of Revelation. That's near the end, chapter 20. In fact, the millennium is only mentioned in one chapter in the whole Bible, and that's Revelation 20. There is no mention of a millennium anywhere else in Scripture, only Revelation 20. But Revelation 20 is not what the whole book of Revelation is about. In fact, Revelation 20, in some people's view, is sort of tagged on as almost like an appendix to the main body of the book, especially after you have the 7 letters to the 7 churches in the first 3 chapters. Chapter 4 begins to introduce a series of judgments. First, you have the breaking of 7 seals on a document. And when these seals are broken, cataclysmic events or actors are revealed. Then there's 7 trumpets that sound. And each trumpet brings about a horrendous event on earth. And then, later still in the book, in chapter 16, there's 7 bowls of wrath, and each one is poured out, and these bring about terrible plagues on the earth. When you read the book of Revelation, you read about these horrible plagues, you think, wow, when is this supposed to take place? And, what would it be like to be here for that? Well, that whole section, it's actually from Revelation 4 to Revelation 19, which is essentially the whole book, except for the first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters. Revelation 4 through 19 is about this series of plagues. And most people have referred to this section of plague-ridden history as the tribulation. But the 4 views do not have to do with 4 views of the millennium, which is in chapter 20, has to do with 4 views of this tribulation period. And they are, like I say, much more radically different from one another than merely the pre-trib rapture, mid-trib rapture, post-trib rapture. These views do not all agree that the tribulation is even a future event at all. In fact, only the futurist view holds that. The futurist view is what most of us are familiar with. On this view, I'll just summarize it. Revelation spends 3 chapters at the beginning where Jesus dictates 7 letters to 7 churches. There's not an awful lot of conflict of opinion about these. There are some differences of opinion about them, but they're not the central controversy of the book. It's when chapter 4 happens, when John is caught up into heaven, he sees the throne of God, he sees a book in chapter 5 in the right hand of him that sits on the throne. The book has 5 seals on it. No one seems to be qualified to open the book until Jesus is introduced as a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns, who's been slain and is qualified or worthy to open the book and break its seals. So then the angels all rejoice. Not only the angels, the elders and all the inhabitants of heaven are rejoicing through the second half of chapter 5 till the end of that. When you get to chapter 6, the Lamb begins to open the seals one by one. And the opening of the seals brings about certain judgments. Now, the futurist view holds that these judgments are all confined to a 7-year period, which they call the tribulation. They consider that Jesus, of course, will come, but before he comes, there'll be 7 years of tribulation. Now, the book of Revelation has a lot of 7s in it. There are 7 churches, 7 lampstands, 7 stars, 7 seals on the book, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of wrath, 7 woes, or 7 beatitudes. There's 7 thunders. There's all kinds of 7s. The book of Revelation is constructed to feature the number 7 significantly. The one 7 that you don't find in Revelation is a 7-year period. Interestingly, a book that's so full of 7s, it lacks any reference to a 7-year tribulation. In fact, this really shocked me when I learned it, because I had taught the views I had been taught for many years. I remember a friend of mine, another minister, and I were sitting around talking about the things of God, and he says, where do we really get this idea of a 7-year tribulation? And I scanned in my mind the relevant texts, and I thought, well, Revelation I know doesn't mention 7 years. The Olivet Discourse, which most people think is about the tribulation, it doesn't mention 7 years. And I realized that the only reason that anyone ever said there's a 7-year tribulation is because the tribulation mentioned in Revelation is identified in their minds with the 70th week of Daniel, in Daniel 9. I won't go into that prophecy, but the point is, the identification of the 70th week of Daniel with the tribulation is, I'd have to say, arbitrary. It's gratuitous. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests that the 70th week of Daniel is the tribulation of which Jesus in Revelation spoke. They just spoke of tribulation. Now, in Revelation, there are some dates, some periods. There's a period of 3.5 years. It's mentioned 5 times in a space of 4 chapters. Chapters 11, 12, and 13 make that 3 chapters. In chapters 11, 12, and 13 in Revelation, there are 5 references to a period of 3.5 years. It's very common, in fact, well nigh universal for futurist interpreters to say that there are 2 periods of 3.5 years. You put them together, you get 7. But the book of Revelation by no means indicates that there are 2 different sets. As far as anyone could tell, every time 3.5 years is mentioned, it could be the same 3.5 years. And for many centuries, this was the assumption of readers of the book of Revelation, that whenever you come to the 3.5 years, it's always the same one. The futurist, though, is looking for a 7-year tribulation, so they take these 3.5 years. There are 5 references. They're going to make some of them refer to the first 3.5 years, and some of them refer to the second 3.5 years, and make a total of 7. Well, there doesn't seem any real biblical reason to do that, certainly not an exegetical one, but if people want to do that, it's not a problem to me. It's not an issue. The thing is, the futurist view believes that the entire tribulation period from chapter 4 through chapter 19 is all confined to a future 7-year period which is yet to begin. Now, certain futurists believe that the church will be raptured before that tribulation. Some believe the church will be raptured or taken out of the world in the middle of the tribulation, and then some believe that the church will be raptured at the end of the tribulation. But all of these views, the pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib, all have something in common. They believe in a future tribulation, and they believe that most of Revelation is therefore talking about a future time that has not yet begun. And that makes the view futuristic in the sense that they interpret the passages as being about the future. Now, I've been saying there are 3 different views besides that, and I've implied that they don't all see it all as the future. You might say, well, how in the world could you see it other than that? Has there ever been a time in history when the sea turned to blood and all the fish in the sea died? Has there ever been a time when a mountain was thrown into the sea aflame? Has there ever been a time when there were 100-pound hailstones pelting the ground? Has there ever been a time when a world dictator, gave out a mark for everyone to take and they couldn't buy or sell without that mark? These things have never happened in the past, they say, and therefore it must be future. And that is the primary reason for being futurist, actually. There's nothing in the book of Revelation that says these things will happen at the end of the world, or these things are very far off. In fact, the indicators in the book of Revelation is the opposite. John indicated they are not very far off from the time of his writing. But if the futurist view is correct, then they were very far off from John's time of writing, 2,000 years at least. Since they haven't started yet, it might be more than that. Which means there's actually nothing in the book of Revelation that would tell us that it's about some time very distant from John's time at the end of the world. True, there are visions in there that seem to refer to the second coming of Christ, and that is still future. And therefore, I think that's what they think. They think the whole book of Revelation only covers 7 years before the period of Christ, and since Christ is there, it must be, since we're apparently more than 7 years from the fulfillment, that must be in the future. That's the futurist view. The main advantages of this view are that, as I said, if you're going to take these visions literally, you really can't say these things have happened in the past. The things I just described and many things in Revelation have not happened literally at any time in history. And because they have not happened literally, and because many people feel that we should be committed to a literal approach to interpreting Revelation, the strongest argument for a futurist view is that, well, it hasn't happened yet, it must be future. This would make it, of course, non-falsifiable. You can't prove what won't, you can't say, well, that's not going to happen in the future. How can you prove anything about what may or may not happen in the future? So they are immune from disproof. It is impossible to say, no, these things will not happen in the future, therefore the futures are wrong, because no one can really say, unless God says, what the future will hold. We can't disprove the future's view that way. But it has a wide support, the view, and frankly, most of the largest churches in the world preach the future's view. The denomination I used to be part of back in 1970 is it's one of the 10 largest denominations in the world, and their whole ministry is built on the futurist view of Revelation. They hardly talk about anything else. They have their own radio network, and every time you listen to their radio network, they talk about Revelation and talk about the future and things like that. You could easily get the impression, if you don't read much, that there's really only one view of Revelation anyone has ever held, and that it's about the end of the world. But there are 3 others, and these views are all older than the futurist view. One is just the opposite of the futurist view. It's called the preterist view. The word preter is a Latin word that means the past. So the futurist view holds that Revelation is about the future. The pastist view, the preterist view, holds that it's about the past. That is to say that the things in the book did happen in the past. So it's describing events that have been fulfilled. The support for this idea is probably largely the fact that the book of Revelation says that the things in it are about to happen. And the book was written to contemporary churches in the first century, 7 churches in Asia Minor, that, even the names of some of the people in those churches are named in Revelation. They're contemporary people. And he tells those people, this is going to be soon. For example, the opening verse of Revelation says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, things which must shortly take place. Now, he said these things are shortly to take place. In the 2 verses later, still in the introduction to the book, in verse 3 it says, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy of this book, and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. Okay, so this is written to contemporary Christians in the first century. They received this letter from Jesus, which is what the Revelation is. It's a dictated letter from Christ. And he says, the things in this book, they're about to take place. They'll shortly come to pass. The time is near, which would suggest to them that the time was near and that the things would come about shortly thereafter. Now, the book emphasizes this in other ways. In the last chapter of the book, in Revelation 22 and verse 10, it says, the angel said to me, do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. Now, this is sort of saying the same thing we read in the introduction of the book. The time is at hand, it's coming soon. But this has another feature. He says, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, because the time is at hand. Now, this is a deliberate echo of what Daniel was told by an angel when he wrote his book. Daniel, like Revelation, is a book of apocalyptic visions. They had to do with the future of Daniel's time, just as this has to do with the future from John's perspective. But the prophecies of Daniel are essentially fulfilled. I mean, if you study the book of Daniel, they were future from Daniel's time, but they're not future from our time. The rise and fall of Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome, those are ancient history. That doesn't mean it wasn't prophecy. Those visions looked forward to things in Daniel's generation, but those things are not something we in our generation look forward to. They're past. They've happened since then. That's the way that the preterist views the book of Revelation. They say, it's like Daniel. These visions did talk about things that were going to happen, that were future from the standpoint of the writer and the readers, but they're not future anymore. He said they would happen soon. Now, in this case, it's interesting because the angel says, don't seal up the words of this book. The angel gave Daniel opposite instructions. In Daniel chapter 12, Daniel said, what shall the end of these things be? And the angel said, go your way, Daniel. The book is sealed up until the time of the end. Seal up the words of this book. Now, when he told him to seal up the prophecy, he's basically saying, roll it up, put a wax seal on it, date it, and put it in the archives or put it in the library, and someday it'll be applicable. It's not applicable right away, so seal it up and put it away in storage. Someday when these things are fulfilled, you can open it, you'll see the seal when it was written, it'll prove it was written before the events, and that'll be a proof that Daniel, you're a real prophet. Actually, Isaiah also in, I guess it's Isaiah, let me think here. I think it's Isaiah 8. He says to his disciples, seal up the law, meaning the prophecy he gave, among my disciples. So to seal up a prophecy was a way of saying it's not going to be fulfilled real soon. This can go into storage because the time it's related to is off in the future, too far off to worry about it right now. Now, what's interesting is the angel told John, don't seal up the words of this prophecy because the time is near. Now, that's a direct opposite of what the angel told Daniel, because Daniel's prophecies weren't going to be fulfilled immediately in his time. Some of them actually were. The rest, I think, have been fulfilled since. But they were kind of off a few hundred years from his time. That was a long way off, a few hundred years off after Daniel's time. Seal that up, that's for someone later on. But this was not for people a few hundred years off or a few thousand years off. This was for people in John's time. Don't seal this up because the time is at hand, he's told. Now, these statements in the book of Revelation seem to give a very strong reason for anticipating, for these people to anticipate that the prophecies that were going to happen soon. And I will say this, that the futurists, when they're confronted with this particular information, they say, well, you know, a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So even though these things didn't happen right after John's time, nor in the next century, the next millennium, or even now they haven't happened yet, they say, that's only 2,000 years, that's only 2 days, so it was really soon. If it happens in our time, that was a soon fulfillment. Now, frankly, I have to just say that sounds desperate to me. When you're writing to people who don't live longer than 100 years, and you say this is going to happen soon, you're giving them the impression that they should be prepared for this. It's not really thousands of years off. By the way, if God is saying, it's soon from my perspective as God, and for me a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, it could be 1,000,000 years off then, because that's not really so far off for God, but he's not writing to God, he's writing to people. He's communicating with people, he's giving them information. And if in fact, he said, it's happening soon, but he meant, you know, from God, my perspective, it's not so far off, it's only 2,000 years. He might as well have said nothing about whether it was soon or not, because it wasn't soon from human point of view. It's only misleading. I mean, if it's 2,000 years off, 10,000 years off, okay, for God that's soon. But he would have misled his readers less if he had said nothing about how long it was. Saying it's soon, it's about to happen, the time is near, don't seal up the book, that's a very strong way of giving people the impression that it's not very far off, and they might well expect it even perhaps in their time. Now, many of the things that are recorded in Revelation seem to also be predicted by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, which is found in 3 of the Gospels. You might be most familiar with it in Matthew 24, the first time it appears in the canon as it's arranged today, but Mark 13 also has it, and Luke 21. Now, almost all students of Revelation, I say almost all because there might be some who don't, but I'm not aware of any. Almost all students of Revelation believe that when Jesus talked about, as it says in Matthew 24:21, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not from the beginning of the world, nor ever shall be. That's in Matthew 24. That's the same tribulation that is mentioned in Revelation 7:14, where it says, these have come up out of the great tribulation, and they've washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb and made them white. So there's a great tribulation in Revelation. Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 great tribulation. I don't know of any scholars who think those are different times. In other words, most scholars would agree, and I won't disagree with them myself, that Matthew 24 is like a short version of the book of Revelation. It's interesting that that short version of Revelation is not found in the Gospel of John. It's only found in what we call the Synoptic Gospels. Why didn't John record it? It may be because he'd already written Revelation. Why write the short version when he's already given the unabridged, 3-hour version of the movie? So Jesus, when he spoke about the Great Tribulation, he said in Matthew 24 and in the parallels in Mark 13 and Luke 21, he said, this generation will not pass before all these things are fulfilled. So we've got Jesus and the book of Revelation both talking about this tribulation period. John says these things are going to happen soon. Jesus said this generation won't pass before these things take place. So for this reason, preterists believe that we really have to look at the book of Revelation as describing things that in fact did happen in that generation, did happen soon after that, and for us they are past. Just like when we read Daniel about the fall of Babylon or Media, Persia, or Greece or Rome, those things are past. They were future from his point of view, not from ours. And that's how the preterist views the book of Revelation. Now, what past events do they think they were? Well, this is very controversial because it depends very much on when the book was written. If you have a study Bible or a modern commentary on Revelation, and you look at the introduction to the book, almost certainly you will be told that Revelation was written during the reign of Domitian in the final decade of the first century, about 96 probably AD. This is the common view today. In an earlier century, the most common view is it was written in the time of Nero, and that the beast even referred to Nero, and that Nero died in 69 AD at his own hand. He committed suicide in 69 AD. So if it was written during the reign of Nero, then it was written before 69 AD, which is the death of Nero. This fly left Mike Pence and came after me now. It won't be in the news, though, no, I'm sure. Not front page, anyway. So if the book was written in the reign of Nero, as many scholars throughout history have believed, then what might have happened shortly after that that could possibly fill this description? Well, the most important thing in history that happened shortly after the death of Nero was the destruction of Jerusalem. Not just the destruction of Jerusalem. It wasn't simply, the fall of another major ancient city, like, for instance, the fall of Troy. It was more like the end of an era, because Jerusalem housed the temple, the Jewish temple, which was the system of worship that God had set up through Moses 1,400 years earlier. For 1,400 years, a very big chunk of history, God dealt with people through his revelation to Israel, and the worship of God had to be at the temple through the Levitical priesthood, offering sacrifices. This was all that they knew for a millennium and a half in Israel. And then the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, and that whole system's gone. The Jews to this day they're still scratching their heads. They actually do believe, Orthodox Jews today believe that the temple was destroyed as a judgment against their people for their sins. But many Christians believe, in fact, it was a judgment on Israel for their sins, and the sin in particular was crucifying the Messiah. And therefore, what we read in Revelation is a protracted description of really the Jewish war, which led up to and includes the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jewish war started in summer of 66 AD went on for about 3.5 years and ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, that's the preterist view. You might say, but the things in Revelation didn't actually happen in 70 AD, did they? All those strange things? You know, horses with heads of lions that breathe fire, and they have snake tails that bite people, and locusts that had tails like scorpions and hair like women and faces like men and, you know, teeth like lions. I mean, were there those kinds of things happening in 70 AD? Well, not exactly in those terms. What we have to understand, no matter what view of Revelation we take, is that Revelation is a book of a very different sort than all the other books in the New Testament. It is what scholars would call apocalyptic literature. It is the only sample of apocalyptic literature as a whole book in the New Testament, but there are some in the Old Testament. Daniel is one of them, Zechariah is another. And between the two testaments, there's a period of 400 years where the Jews wrote a lot of books, and they used this type of writing. What I mean by this type of writing is they described things on an earthly events in terms that would sound like they're like supernatural, crazy science fiction, kinds of events. And we're not used to that. In Western culture, most of our writers write in literal form, but that was not necessarily the case in the days of the apostles. And I want to give you an example of apocalyptic writing that's not in the Bible itself. It's not Revelation or Daniel. This is something that was written a couple hundred years before Christ by some anonymous Jewish writer. Now, this writer had the biblical book of Esther in his hands, and he decided to write a prologue to the book and an epilogue. But because he lived at a time when Jewish writers used apocalyptic imagery a lot, he wrote these in apocalyptic form. And you can find this prologue and epilogue to Esther, for example, in the Catholic Bible, which has certain apocalyptic books in it that we don't have in our Bible. They don't belong in our Bible, they're not inspired, but this was an anonymous writer who pretended that he was writing as Mordecai, one of the characters in the book, Esther's uncle. Now, I don't know how much you know about the book of Esther. It's just an ordinary book about God's providential raising up of a Jewish woman to be queen in Persia after the Jews were released to go back from Babylon. Some stayed in Persia, and a Jewish girl became queen, and her position made her able to save her people from a slaughter that was there was a conspiracy against the Jews, and her position made it possible for her to spare the Jews. That's what the book is about. There are no miracles in the book. In fact, it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, though you can see the providence of God throughout the book. But an apocalyptic writer a few centuries before Christ added his own touch to the book of Esther, which was much more ancient, and he wrote apocalyptic prologue and epilogue. And let me read what he wrote. Before the book of Esther, he's placed this prologue, and he's claiming that to be Mordecai. And he talks about having had a dream. He says, "Behold, noise and confusion, thunders and earthquake, tumult upon the earth. Behold, two great dragons came forward, both ready to fight, and they roared terribly. And at their roaring, every nation prepared for war to fight against the nation of the righteous. And behold, a day of darkness and gloom, tribulation and distress, affliction, and great tumult upon the earth. The whole righteous nation was troubled. They feared the evils that threatened them and were ready to perish. Then they cried to God, and from their cry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. Light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted and consumed those who were held in honor." And then follows the book of Esther in its very comparably mundane prose. But this is the dream that Mordecai, this author claiming to be Mordecai, said he had. Now, you can see that many of the features of this dream are very much like the book of Revelation. There's dragons, there's, a river, there's tumult, there's tribulation, there's light and darkness, there's all kinds of things. Thunders, earthquakes, confusion. All the nations of the world are gathering for war. I mean, this sounds like, it doesn't sound exactly like the book of Revelation, but it definitely sounds like it's in the same genre, and it is. But what's interesting is after the book of Esther is completed, the same author added an epilogue. And here's his epilogue. He interprets his dream. He says, I remember the dream that I had concerning these matters, and none of them has failed to be fulfilled. Really? In his time, dragons had fought each other? All the nations of the world prepared themselves for war? Well, he said, not one of these things has failed to be fulfilled. The tiny stream, which became a river, and there was light and the sun and abundant water, the river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. The two dragons are Haman and myself. Now, Haman's the bad guy in this story, and Mordecai is the good guy. The two dragons are Haman and myself. The nations are those gathered to destroy the name of the Jews, and my nation, this is Israel, who cried out to God and were saved. Now, the value of this particular bit of apocalyptic writing from the intertestamental period in our understanding of Revelation is very great, because we not only have the apocalyptic description, but we have the actual story in prose. We know the story because we read the book of Esther, and it's really quite earthly. It's really quite historical, and doesn't have any magic or miracles or witches or goblins or any of those things in it. And yet, we see how the story is cast in an apocalyptic manner by this 2nd century BC author. And you see that he's really talking about quite ordinary earthly events, though he sounds like he's talking about science fiction. And that's because that's what apocalyptic literature did. It's based on the idea that somebody has a dream or a vision, highly symbolic. The visions of Daniel, if you're familiar with them, are very good characteristics. And obviously, they're not literal. Daniel sees a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a 10-horned beast come out of the sea. One is like a lion, one's like a bear, one's like a leopard, one's like a beast with 10 horns. And the first one is the Babylonian Empire. Well, the Babylonian Empire is not a literal lion. The lion represents it. The second one, the bear, is the Medo-Persian Empire. Again, not literal. It wasn't an animal. It's represented by an animal. Alexander the Great in the Grecian Empire is by the leopard, and the Roman Empire by this beast with 10 horns. So we see in Daniel and in, frankly, Zechariah, a book that Christians are much less familiar with, but if you read it, it's got about 10 visions of the prophet, and Revelation. These are the books in the Bible that are most like the apocalyptic literature, that of which this prologue and epilogue of Esther are a good sample. Now, knowing that, we come to the book of Revelation knowing that this kind of literature had been around for some time and was very popular among the Jews and Christians. They have found now in modern times at least a dozen apocalyptic works from the Jews that were from the intertestamental period. They all use the same manner of expression. So when Revelation used this manner of expression, it was using a familiar manner of expression. It'd be like C.S. Lewis writing his space trilogy used space science fiction as the genre, but he's getting across a Christian message. Or when he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he's using children's fairy tales as a genre, but he's getting across a Christian message. So the writer of Revelation, inspired by the Holy Spirit, I should say actually Jesus himself, presents this information in the form of what would have been a very popular genre of literature at the time. Which means that we don't look for real dragons fighting dragons. We don't look for real wars that involve every nation in the world armed. And we don't look for a little spring that becomes a river. We don't look for literal oceans turning to blood, for example. Now, if you're a preterist, you have to assume that the book was written before the fall of Jerusalem, because you would believe that that's what it's predicting. That's not something that can be proven. Again, modern scholars often prefer to say it was written in the reign of Domitian in 96 AD, but that's awfully late to be predicting something that happened 25 years earlier. So if it was written in the reign of Domitian, then the preterist view seems to be off the table. But there's no proof that it was written in 96 AD. I won't go into it now. There are arguments for both dates. I personally accept the earlier date. I think the evidence is, frankly, stronger for the earlier date, but some would disagree. I give the evidence for and against both dates in my book, but I'm not trying to sell the book. I just don't have time to give that information now. So the idea is that the destruction of Jerusalem, one of the most important events in all of history, the passing away of the Old Covenant, of Second Temple Judaism, replaced as it is by the New Covenant and the kingdom of God in Christ. That's an earth-shaking event. That's one of the greater events in all of history. And it deserves the kind of attention the book of Revelation would be giving it if the preterist view is correct. So, the preterist view is the opposite of futurist. Futurist says it's all about the future. The preterist says pretty much mostly all of it's about the past. Now, as a preterist, one might still hold that a few places in the book look forward to the second coming of Christ as the resolution of all things. But the visions are primarily about past events, generally understood to be about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, there's two other views. What's left? What could be left? You've got it's all future, it's all past. How could there be two different remaining views? Well, there are. Actually, probably the oldest of the views is called the historicist view. I say probably the oldest because in the first 3 centuries, no full commentaries on Revelation were written by the church fathers, and so we don't know what the earliest view was, but when commentaries did begin to come out, they seemed to lean to a large degree toward what we now call the historicist view. This view is that the prophecies of Revelation are not all about the past or about the future. They're about the whole age of the church, that it actually is a panorama of the whole age of the past 2,000 years, that the breaking of the 7 seals actually has to do with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The sounding of the 7 trumpets are depicting the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire later to the Muslims. And then when you get to the bowls of wrath, interestingly, some feel like that's the fall of the papacy and the French Revolution and things like that. The 2 witnesses are thought to represent the Bible that's published in the Reformation times and so forth. The beast in this view is considered to be the papacy, the popes. The whole institution of the papacy is considered to be the beast. This view was held by all the reformers. Martin Luther held it, John Calvin held it, the pre-Reformation guys like William Tyndale, Wycliffe, Huss, they all held this view. In fact, even Roman Catholics held this view. The Franciscan order, long before the Reformation, held this view. And so it's an old view. It's been around a long time. But it happened to be the universal view of the reformers, and therefore it came to be called the Protestant view. You would hardly find any Protestant who held a different view than the historicist view of Revelation from the time of the Reformation into the 16th century, early 16th century, until, frankly, the early 19th century. For many centuries, it was the Protestant view. And yet, how many of you had heard of it before tonight? Not probably very many, unless you were Seventh-day Adventists, because the Seventh-day Adventists are the main group today that still hold that view. I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't hold that view. But it does have some worthy advocates from the past. And so the historicist view holds it's not all about the past or the future, but the early part is about things that are now past. The latter part is about things that are yet future. And the middle part is just moving on through history. Okay? That's the historicist view. Now, the last view to consider is called the idealist view. I have to say that in this edition of my first edition of the book, I referred to it as the spiritual view. The authors who hold this view give it various names. And when I wrote my book and tried to represent it in the 4th column, I had to pick of the various names. I chose the word spiritual view. I later regretted it. And this brother down here has the 2nd edition of the book. I changed it to the idealist view, which is really the most common way of speaking of it. What is the idealist view? Well, the idealist view holds that the book is a symbolic drama made up of 7 acts. And each act has 7 scenes. Now, each of these acts is kind of parallel to the others. And the whole of it, each of these acts, really are relevant to the whole church age, but do not refer to any particular events. In other words, they're not talking about things that are about to happen or things that once happened or things that are happening now. They're talking about principles that are transcendent to all time. Things like the sovereignty of God, depicted by the fact that the 4 horsemen come only at God's command. So he's sovereign over earthly events. Things like the spiritual warfare in which the church is engaged. You find that discussed, of course, in chapters 12 and 13, if not elsewhere too. The idea that Christ is the victor over Satan is depicted in many ways in the book. These are truths that aren't related to any one event, either past, present, or future. They're always true. And that those truths are depicted symbolically in dramatic form in 7 visions. Each vision really covers the whole age of the church from a different angle. So that the 7 letters to the 7 churches are looking at the whole church age from a certain angle. The 7 seals that are broken are looking at the whole age from another angle. And that the 7 trumpets look at the whole age from another angle still, and that there's 7 of these. Now, while I do not hold this view of the book of Revelation altogether, I believe there's merit in it in some measure. I believe some parts of the book are depicting transcendent realities and not, strictly speaking, individual events. And this view, by the way, is pretty widely held among evangelicals today. It might be, I'm not sure, it might be one of the most popular views among evangelicals who are not taking the futurist view. But as you can see, the views are very different, radically different. Because the view that most people have heard is that the Revelation is all about the end of the world, the future. But the other 3 views don't think so. They either think that it was all fulfilled in the past, that it's been in the process of fulfillment for the past 2,000 years and it's moving on through history, or that it's not really about historical things at all. It's not connected to any time frame. It's talking about things that are true in heaven, universally true things. The fact that the saints, when they're martyred, are vindicated and enthroned in heaven. Truths like that. It's more like a theological treatment written in apocalyptic form. One might, if they took this view, compare it to, say, Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress isn't about any particular Christian or any particular time. It's depicting the whole of the Christian experience in the allegory of an individual making a journey. It's a story, but the story is not really about anyone in particular. It's kind of about everyone. It's about every Christian. Now, that's not exactly what the idealist view would say of Revelation, but it's perhaps connected to history in that same way. It's got stories, it's got narrative, it's got visions of things happening. But these are not referring to specific things that happen at specific times, but rather they are more an illustration of truths that are true at all times. So those are the 4 views. And people usually want me to tell what my view is, but I think, what does it matter? There's people smarter than me on every camp. So my view is just another view. I do hold a view, and it is a combination of more than one. I'll just tell you, I believe many of the visions are talking about Jerusalem falling in 70 AD. I'm a partial preterist. I believe some of the visions, especially the ones in the middle of the book and at the very end, are best seen in the idealist way. And perhaps it's when people do mix the views in their own concoction, they usually are mixing something of preterism and idealism together. And I have to say I do that. Though I have to say I first started out as a futurist, of course, and then I became an idealist. Because the second view I became aware of was the idealist view. I read a very compelling book by William Hendrickson called, I've read so many books, the title escapes me, but it's More Than Conquerors. It's called More Than Conquerors by William Hendrickson, a very excellent book presenting the idealist view. But I later became really familiar with what happened in the Jewish war as recorded by Josephus. And And much of what happened in the Jewish war, reading Josephus, a non-Christian author, you'd think he had read Revelation and was trying to describe it happening, because he talks about many things that happened in the Roman siege of Jerusalem especially, and the fall, in terms that are very reminiscent of some of the visions of Revelation. If I had more time, I'd go into those, but you know, I wanted to leave time for question and answer too. So if you want to examine those views more thoroughly, you can do one of two things. You can get 50 commentaries and read them all, or you can get one, and I summarize all the better arguments of all the views. And you would not, if you read this, you would not be able to tell which view is mine, because I did not write this to advocate a view. I wrote this to educate people about the options and let them do what I did, make up their own minds. So that's what I would have you do too. I'm not trying to sell the book, but I will say it's a much smaller financial investment to buy this than to buy the books I had to buy when I was writing it. Are there any questions? They could be about this. I'm sure there are questions about this, or they could be about anything else about the Bible. Braxton, who introduced me, mentioned I have a daily radio show. I'm on about 30 stations around the country every day for an hour, and I answer Bible questions for people who call in live. And I've been doing it for 23 years, since 1997. And so I've heard millions of questions. I don't know all the answers. I don't pretend to know all the answers, but I have heard them all. I've heard all the questions. So I'd be comfortable with any question you have about any part of the Bible, but I would imagine some of you would have in your mind right now certain questions about Revelation. Yes, Tegan.
Are we considered in Revelation 12 the offspring of the woman, even us?
The woman in Revelation 12 is apparently Israel. He's asking.
Yeah,
Oh.
you want to ask it just so they're.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Go ahead.
right in front of us.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we were considered 2,000 years later, are we also considered part of the offspring of the woman?
In my opinion, yes. In my opinion, yes. For those who don't know what he's talking about, Revelation 12 has a woman pregnant, about ready to give birth, a dragon who's ready to kill the child at its birth. The child is said to be destined to rule the nations with a rod of iron. The child is born and escapes the machinations of the dragon and is caught up to the throne of God in heaven. That, I believe, is a summary of the birth of Christ, Satan's attempt to kill him when he was a baby through Herod, and the fact that Jesus ascended to heaven, he's now at the throne of God. Later in the chapter, we find the dragon then pursues this woman into the wilderness, and he makes war with her and the rest of her offspring. And his question is, are we the rest of her offspring? The woman, I believe, can be, with a fair degree of certainty, identified as Israel, or perhaps as the faithful remnant of Israel, who brought Christ into the world. And the one who fled into the wilderness is also the remnant of Israel, who fled, as we know historically, before the Jewish war, before the Romans came. The church in Jerusalem, the Jewish remnant, fled to Pella across the Jordan, and they survived and were sustained by God. So I believe the woman fleeing from the dragon is also the remnant of Israel, which is the Jewish church, the Jewish followers of Christ. And it says, and the dragon made war with her and with the rest of her offspring. And it identifies them as the ones who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. Well, who keeps the commandments of God and has the testimony of Jesus but the Christians? And the woman herself is, I believe, the Jewish church, so the rest of her offspring must be the Gentiles who have come to faith through the Jewish witness. That's my understanding. Yes?
One, verse 11, when they overcame him by the blood,
Yeah.
I know that there's different views of that.
Well, that's
Yes.
true. Yeah, Revelation 12:11 says they overcame him. Now, they means the saints overcame him, that is the devil in the context. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. So this is talking about the warfare of the church against Satan's malice, and it's an ongoing warfare. We're still in it. This is part of the book of Revelation that I don't take in a preterist way. I take this in an idealist way, so I think it has to do with the whole age of the church. So I think that this warfare against the woman and her offspring includes us. Now, the warfare, there are two aspects of warfare. One is defensive, and the other is offensive. Now, the defensive warfare is against the devil's attacks, and in the context, the particular attacks are his accusations, because this is the only place in the Bible that calls Satan the accuser of the brethren. It says the accuser of the brethren has been cast down, who accused the brethren before God day and night, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. That is, they overcame the prosecutor, the accuser, the one who is making a big deal about their failures and their sins. He was accusing them, and they overcame those and overcame the condemnation through appeal to what Jesus had, Jesus' blood. Ephesians 1:7 says we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. And John twice tells us that the blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin. So that being so, the devil accuses us to try to bring us into condemnation, but we resort to appealing to the blood of the Lamb as our defense. So that, as it says in Romans 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? Who can lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It's God who justifies. And so God justifies us through the blood of Christ, and that is our defense against the devil's accusations. Now, that's the defensive warfare against his attacks, but we have an offensive mode also, and that is, and by the word of their testimony. Now, the word of your testimony isn't you telling the story of how you got saved. In Revelation, the testimony of the saints is the gospel. John says right in chapter 1, I was on the island of Patmos for the testimony of Jesus Christ. Didn't mean he went there to give his testimony to people in Patmos. It meant he was imprisoned there because of preaching the gospel. Throughout the book of Revelation, the witness, the faithful witness, the testimony, these are terms that are referring to Jesus and the church presenting the gospel. And so we overcome Satan by the defense of the blood of Christ against our souls because of the accusations of the enemy. But also we offend. We take territory by preaching the gospel. We take the gospel of the kingdom into the enemy's territory and win people for Christ and take them from the devil. So his territory is reduced by the increase of Christ's territory. The territory is measured in souls of men. But when a soul comes out from under Satan's dominion into Christ, Satan has lost some territory and Christ has gained some. So it's our offensive against the enemy through our testimony, that is our preaching of the gospel, that Satan loses territory. So we've got the defense and the offense. And the final statement is they did not love their lives to the death. The martyrdom of the saints, the willingness to die for the faith, has been a very potent feature in the conversion of the Roman Empire and the conversion of many. A Christian who dies for his faith very often will change many things. Tertullian said the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. You know, actually the gladiatorial games, which the Romans enjoyed for centuries, were ended because of a Christian martyr. A man named Telemachus. He was a hermit, a Christian hermit. He came to town once during the gladiatorial games. He was appalled to see these gladiators killing each other, so he jumped down into the arena, got between them and rebuked them in the name of Jesus for their bloodthirsty contest. They killed him. But his death appalled the crowd so much that they disapproved of gladiatorial games. It is said that was the last one. I mean, the blood of martyrs has an impact on society and on the spread of the gospel. So this is how the church overcomes Satan in this global warfare to supplant the kingdom of darkness with the kingdom of God, preaching the kingdom of God and being willing to die for it. It's a good question. Seems like I answered it recently. Oh yeah, that was on today's show. Yeah, it was.
Well, I'm going to ask something so that if anyone's wondering it, they don't have to ask it. So if we take what you've said today to be true, Steve, what if the next phase of credit cards is not that they put it into my iPhone, but that they want to put it in my hand and in my forehead? Should I be afraid about that?
I'm very much against intrusive surgeries, and I would reject it. I would not accept it, but not because I think it's what Revelation 13 is talking about. Revelation 13 introduces the beast that comes out of the sea, followed by the beast that comes from the land, and the second beast encourages people, in fact, requires people to worship the first beast, and the beast then sets up a requirement that everyone must bear a mark it says they must have the mark of his, they have to have either the name or the mark or the number of the beast, either in their hand or on their forehead. It says if they do not take this mark, they cannot buy or sell. Now, based on this, and based on the futurist view, many have said this is what's going to happen soon, that the Antichrist, the beast, will rise. He will be a world dictator. He will establish a non-currency economic system, financial system, a cashless society, and that you'll only be able to buy things with a credit number, which is the way most people buy them now anyway, through Amazon. And that being so, people will be actually required to get something on their hand or their forehead to indicate that this is how they will purchase things. So it is usually thought to be a credit number, a built-in one, not on your iPhone, but on you. And this is how the futurists usually describe this. Now, how would I describe it? Well, not like that. When I was young, it was commonly said by futurist teachers that this mark was going to be a laser tattoo on your hand or forehead, that you would scan it at the point of purchase and it would deduct something from your account like a debit card, and you would not be able to use cash or credit cards or anything else. It's all on your hand. You have to scan it. If you can't scan it, you can't buy food, so you're going to die because you can't eat. I actually had a caller, kind of a nutty caller, on my show once who said, well, if I have to take the mark, I'll take it. I said, well, why would you do that? He said, well, because I'd have to, because I couldn't eat without it. I said, but the Bible says if you have the mark, you're going to go to hell. He said, well, I got no choice. I got to eat, you know. Well, you do have a choice. You can love not your life, even to the death. You can be loyal to Christ. But I will tell you this, I don't see this passage anymore as a reference to something literally put on someone's hand or forehead. Now, I'm aware every futurist teacher can come up with news stories. You know, already in Florida, they've got an implanted chip they put in some pets, and it's, you know, it's easy to identify them if they get lost and so forth. So they're going to do that in people. They're going to have all your health information, all your medical information, all your credit information, all that, they say. It hasn't happened yet, but they say Bill Gates is up to something along these lines. You'll hear that on YouTube now, all over the place. Bill Gates is going to require us to take a vaccination, and in the needle it's going to be included a little chip that's going to be put in there, and that's the mark of the beast and so forth. Well, I honestly don't know if such a chip is ever going to be given to people. It may well be, because it is, you know, the technology is there. They're capable of doing it. And I would never say it won't happen. But I would say it probably doesn't have anything to do with Revelation 13. Okay? If they came to my door and said, take the chip, I said, no, thank you. And they said, you're going to have to take the chip. I'd still say, no, thank you. I'm not taking it. But I wouldn't do it because I think it's the mark of the beast, honestly. I wouldn't do it because I don't want anyone who's not friendly to me putting things inside my body. It's just kind of a hang-up I have. So, I mean, I just am not going to do that. But it has nothing to do with Revelation 13 in my mind. It would be to many Christians. What I understand to be going on there is this, and it helps to know that immediately after you read about the mark of the beast at the very last verse of Revelation 13, the very next verse, Revelation 14:1 says, I saw the 144,000 standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb, having their father's name on their foreheads. So now we've got a contrast. We've got people who've got the name or the number or the mark of the beast on their foreheads, and another group of people got God's name on their foreheads. Now, the people who have God's name on their foreheads are clearly Christians, but Christians don't actually wear tattoos of God's name on their foreheads. At least most don't. I know a few, actually, who have done that, but that's not what it's talking about. Revelation, when it talks about the people with the name of God on their forehead, is not saying that these people literally have a tattoo of the name of God on their forehead. Nor does it mean they have a chip that God put in their forehead either. It's neither a chip nor a tattoo. It is a symbol. And if it's a symbol there, it's a symbol most likely in Revelation 13 as well. Of what? I heard once what I'm about to tell you, and I'm skeptical when people tell me, oh, in ancient days they did such and such, and it just so happens to go along with somebody's view of Revelation. I'm very skeptical. But I did research this because I was curious about it, and I found it in secular sources online, historical sources, that in the Roman world, if a slave escaped and was recaptured, it was very common to have his master's brand or name put on that slave's forehead or hand. These parts of the body were chosen because these are the parts of the body least likely to be covered with clothing and therefore harder to hide. A slave who had run away once could blend in and escape, but if he was caught again, they'd brand him so that he couldn't blend in. Anyone could just look at him immediately and say, oh, I know who owns you. It's written all over your face. It's written on your forehead, it's on your hand. You have the brand of your owner, like cattle have brands of their owners. That actually was practiced on slaves in the Roman Empire. Now, when John talks about people have to have the mark or the name or the number of the beast on their hand or their forehead, to the original readers who lived in the Roman Empire, they'd say, oh, I see. He's saying these people are the slaves. These people are conspicuously the slaves of the beast. It may have nothing to do with an actual mark any more than the name of God on the forehead of the Christians is an actual mark. It's more of a symbol saying these people are obviously devoted servants of, or at least slaves of, the beast, as opposed to these others who are the slaves of God. It's who, your master's name is on your forehead. Now, the forehead and the hand also remind us of several Old Testament passages where, for example, in Deuteronomy, God said he wanted Israel to bind his laws to their hand and between their eyes, that is, on their forehead. The Jewish people actually do this literally, some of them in Israel. They wear phylacteries, a little box that they actually attach to their forehead or their hand, and they put scripture portions in it because God wanted them to bind the law to their hands or between their eyes. But actually, they're being a little too literal. Jesus even made fun of their phylacteries. When he was rebuking the scribes and Pharisees, he joked about their phylacteries. That's not what God had in mind. He didn't want Israel to wear little boxes on their heads with scripture portions in it. You can't even read them. They're in a box. He wanted them, the hand and the forehead, what's that represent? Your hand represents your works, your actions. Before your eyes, what's before your eyes is what you're giving your attention to, your thoughts and your actions. Now, I believe that the imagery of the servants of the beast having his mark on their foreheads or hands is saying that these people had the conspicuous proof of being slaves of the beast, which would really be seen in their thoughts and their actions. And Israel was to be conspicuously God's servants by having his laws governing their thoughts and their actions. And so, in my opinion, this is all very symbolic. Now, someone says, but they can't buy or sell. It must be something with reference to, finances and commerce. Not necessarily. To not be able to buy or sell is not saying anything about whether money is still in the picture or whether money is accepted in purchases. It's not that. To be boycotted so that people will not buy from you or sell from you or to you or do business with you is a fairly common historical means of persecution that has come upon Christians and in Nazi Germany on Jews. In my life, well, not my lifetime, but my parents' lifetime, Jews in Germany they didn't have marks on their hands or forehead, but they were recognized as Jews, partly by the star on their arm, and Germans would not buy or sell from them. They would not do business with them. That's a form of persecution. It's been a form of persecution throughout history. And therefore, when John tells us if people didn't have this mark, if they weren't compliant, if they weren't conforming to the society of the beast, then people wouldn't do business with them. It doesn't mean there's a cashless society. It just means people would choose not to do business with them because it's a form of persecution. And that it would mention that particular form is no more strange than the fact that in Revelation, martyrdom is always referred to as being beheaded. Now, not all martyrs are beheaded, but all the martyrs in Revelation are beheaded. In other words, being beheaded was one way of being martyred, and it was a way that could be used to stand for all forms of martyrdom. being boycotted for your faith is one way of being persecuted. It could stand for all forms of persecution. I think all that's really saying is, if you're not conforming to the world system, you'll be persecuted in various ways, including perhaps economic boycott. But there's no specific prediction of a cashless society. Now, do I believe there will be a cashless society? Do I believe people will be given a chip? Maybe. But I don't think that's what Revelation is talking about. It's easy to associate those things, but you have to realize when you're as old as I am and read as many books that are older than I am on Revelation, that every generation has been able to find in the book of Revelation things that say, oh, that's happening right now. People who believe in the futurist view have always thought that the futurist view of the Revelation points directly to their own times because of current events. And that's true of people who take the futurist view today as well.
About the number 666, or in some manuscripts it's 616. Which number do you think is in the earliest manuscript? Which number do you think is the correct one? And do you think that that's Nero with that numerology and things like that?
Yeah, most scholars seem to go with the 666 rather than the 616. There are some manuscripts that have the number 616. But what is it? I mean, is it Nero? The interesting thing about the 666, or the number of the beast that's given in Revelation 13:18, is it's introduced this way. John says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, let me point out something. It is a number of a man. It is a man's number. Which man? Well, you got to calculate that yourself. How do you calculate a man's identity from a number? Well, that's easy in those days. In Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, those languages use the letters of their alphabet for numbers. We don't. We have, an alphabet for letters, and we have Arabian numbers separate. In Latin, well, how many of you learned anything about Roman numerals when you were a kid? I did. They may not teach it anymore. The Roman numerals are letters from the Latin alphabet, the Roman alphabet, but they stand for numbers. Greek is that way also, and so is Hebrew. Now that means that in societies that have that kind of language and that kind of ciphers, it's possible to take any word or any name and calculate the number value of each letter and come up with a total, and that was often done. It's called a gematria, when you take the numeric equivalence of the letters of a word and just give that number as sort of a mystery. Who do you think I'm talking about here? Archaeologists have found Roman graffiti where someone wrote 683 loves 294. Well, obviously this is someone telling who they're in love with, but you got to figure out who it is by calculating their number. Now, John says 666 is the number of a man, and if you're wise, you can calculate who it is. Now, I'd want to point out something that you may never thought about. John is writing to people in the first century. He didn't know there would be a second or third or fourth century of the church. He was writing to people of his own time. He says, you guys, if you're wise, if you're clever, I expect you can calculate who I'm talking about here. It's a man, I'll give you that. It's the number of his name. You who are wise, let him who has understanding calculate the number. What this means is that John believed that people living and reading that book in his day would be able to identify who he was talking about if they could decipher the name behind that number, which means that beast was alive at that time. I mean, if he's talking about someone living in our future or in our time, how could anyone living at that time be wise enough to figure out the name? And everyone who I've known who's tried to decipher it with someone in modern history has ended up looking silly. But it is said that the name Caesar Nero, if you use Hebrew characters, comes out to 666. Now, not with Greek characters, not with Latin characters. And one might say, well, if that's what he's talking about, if he's talking about Caesar Nero, why would he give his name in the Hebrew form, which is not, the book of Revelation is not written in Hebrew. He's not even writing to Hebrew people. He's writing to Gentiles. Well, there are some who would say that because he was talking about Nero, he needed to code it. He didn't want hostile powers to know what he was saying about the emperor. Therefore, if he used Latin or Greek, anyone could probably figure it out. I mean, read about the description of the beast. If you're living in the time of Nero, you say, hey, that sounds like him. I don't even need the number to know that. But, you know, if he says his name is 666 and used either a Latin or a Greek numeration, any hostile Roman soldier or politician could say, look, he's obviously talking about Nero. But Hebrew was less known among Romans, but very much known among Christians, because almost all Christian assemblies had Jews in them. Almost all Gentile churches began with a core of Jewish converts from the synagogue who were evangelized, joined later by Gentiles. So it would be possible for a Jew using Hebrew to decipher it. But for the Roman enemies, not so much. So a case can be made that it is referring to Nero in giving his name in the Hebrew form. Now, of course, if the number is really 616, that spoils it. You know, it's not him. But the truth is, John believed that somebody living at that time could be identified from the number he was given, if people were wise and had understanding, could calculate it. And frankly, the description of the beast fits well with Nero. It may fit well with some other emperors after Nero, but their names don't work out. You know, if it only works for one guy, then that's probably the guy, I think. Any other questions? Yes, Pastor.
I had a couple, but I wanted to give people an opportunity, and we've got, I think, about 4 or 5 minutes. One, on a preterist view, is there any kind of significance at all to the fact that Israel came back in 1948 and is established now? It seemed to be a pretty significant thing. What would a preterist say on one hand, and what are your thoughts about that whole event?
Well, the preterist view, you understand, Israel became a nation in modern times in 1948 on May 14th, and many people think that's a very, very significant event with reference to end times prophecy. Many people think that signaled the beginning of the last generation, although it's been really more than an ordinary generation since 1948, but there are still people living who were alive then. The preterist would not see particular significance in that modern event. The book of Revelation itself never actually mentions the restoration of the nation of Israel in ancient times or modern times. The restoration of the nation of Israel is just not a subject mentioned in Revelation in any passage. The destruction is because there's mention in Revelation 11:8 of that city which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord also was crucified, it says, which means Jerusalem is being called Sodom and Egypt, both of which were destroyed by supernatural plagues from God, similar to those in the book of Revelation, interestingly enough, but those are symbolic names given to Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem seems to be identified. For example, in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, he's told to measure the temple. It appears the temple was still standing, pointing to a pre-70 AD date of writing, seemingly, and the measuring of the temple is said to have been to identify that part which would not be given over to the Gentiles, who would trample upon it, the holy city, for 3.5 years or whatever. Now, it certainly describes the destruction of the temple. It suggests it was standing when John wrote it, but it was going to be given over to the Gentiles and they'd trample it down. So it sounds again like it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but it doesn't anywhere talk about Jerusalem being restored, except, of course, Revelation 21 sees the heavenly Jerusalem coming down, dressed as a bride adorned for her husband, but that seems to be the bride of Christ, not the Jewish nation. It's coming down to the new earth. So the preterist view wouldn't find any particular significance in the return of the nation of Israel. Now, you said it seems pretty important, and it certainly does, and it especially does from the standpoint of the futurists who, although it is not mentioned in Revelation, the futurists do believe on other grounds, from other places of the Bible, they do believe in a restoration of the nation of Israel in the end times. They take some of that from Zechariah, they take it from Jeremiah and Ezekiel, places like that. In my opinion, they're misunderstanding those Old Testament passages, which do speak of a restoration of Israel, but they're speaking of the return of the exiles from Babylon and the restoration of Jerusalem in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel before that. So I think those prophecies were fulfilled before the time of Christ. There's no New Testament reference at all to a restoration of the nation of Israel at any time, whether ancient or modern. The restoration of the nation of Israel is simply not mentioned anywhere in the Bible, in the New Testament anyway. And in the Old Testament where it's mentioned, it seems to have been fulfilled in the return of the exiles from Babylon. But then, if that is true, what can a Christian say who's not a futurist and doesn't see any significance in it? How in the world could it be that a nation that was destroyed in 70 AD and scattered over the earth without a homeland for 2,000 years would come back together seemingly miraculously and then be preserved seemingly miraculously against hordes of enemies all around them and to win every battle that seems to threaten to destroy them? What can you make of it? Well, I don't know exactly what to make of it. I would say God is a merciful God. He may well have engineered the return of the Jews to the land and their protection in these wars and so forth. I'm not saying God's against them. I don't think he's against the Irish or the Brazilians either, and anything that might be done on their behalf could be seen as a mercy from God too. The Bible does not mention, for example, the discovery of America, which is also fairly historically significant, I would think, but it's not mentioned in the Bible. If God brought Israel back in the last days, or in our days, that might be a work of God similar, but not necessarily mentioned in the Bible. But I will say this. When you study the manner in which the nation of Israel came about in modern times, it was not without some very, very strong influence from dispensational pastors and politicians. One of the first indicators that maybe there would be a future for the nation of Israel was the Balfour Declaration in England, which Lord Balfour was a premillennial futurist Christian who believed that the Bible thought Israel should become a nation again in the last days, and he lobbied for Britain to be favorable toward that after World War II. World War II, well, actually, he was before World War II, he was before World War I, but after World War II, when the horrors of the Holocaust were made known to the Western world after Germany had opened up, and there was a very strong sentiment on the part of Gentiles that this should never be allowed to happen to the Jews again, and that the only way it could not is if they had their own territory where no one could put them into ovens. And so there's a strong urge to establish a nation for a homeland for Israel after World War II. But before that, at the end of the 19th century, the Zionist movement began. Theodor Herzl was the founder of the Zionist movement. He was not a Christian. He wasn't even an observant Jew. He was a Jew, but he was an atheist, a non-observant Jew. But he thought it'd be great for Israel to have its own land, and so he started a secular movement to lobby for that. And it became, he got influential people with him, and over a period of about 50 years, from the time of Herzl's origins of the Zionist movement to the actual establishment of the nation of Israel, a lot of things happened, many of which had to do with presidents of the United States being lobbied by large numbers of evangelical pastors telling them to support the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, because it was in the theology of those pastors that this should happen. And there was one particular man whose name escapes me right now, who put together a written request that Israel be recognized by America as having a nation in the Middle East and her own homeland, and it was signed by hundreds of important American people, industrial giants, pastors who were much more influential in the country in those days than they are now, bankers and business people and so forth, very important people and politicians. They got signatures for this, and this man presented it to several presidents serially before it finally fell in the lap of a president who was in a position after World War II to say, you know, the world thinks Israel should have a homeland because of this Holocaust thing. Why don't we go for it? Now, he wasn't really that interested in it, but he was very much pressured by dispensational pastors and others. And it was an act of the United Nations that made Israel a nation. And the president, who had been so petitioned, contacted member nations of the UN and said, if you don't vote for Israel's independent nationhood, you'll receive no more support, aid from the United States. So the president manipulated the United Nations to vote for Israel to become a nation. Now, these things are historically true. It doesn't mean that God didn't do it. I mean, these 50 years of machinations and so forth that brought it about could easily be the working of God through non-Christians and through politicians. God does, the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he will. So I'm not saying any of these facts mean it wasn't God's doing, but these facts could explain it happening whether it was God's doing or not. In other words, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The dispensationalists decided this is what's supposed to happen, and they hammered and they hammered and they hammered until it got done. And by the way, the modern Jewish state, many Jewish authors acknowledge about that it was evangelical Christians in America who were largely responsible for America's support of the state of Israel being formed, and without their support, it wouldn't exist today. So it's hard to know what came first, the chicken or the egg. Did the state of Israel come about because the dispensationalists said it was supposed to, or did they say it was supposed to because it was really supposed to happen? That has to be decided on the basis of whatever scriptures they were using and whether they're seeing them correctly or not.
And I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Are you willing to stick around for those who
course.
may want to ask some things? But we wanted to honor everybody's time, and so if
I'm in
we
no
said
hurry.
we're going to go till 8, and Steve will stick around if you want to gather around and ask questions instead in front of the whole room. But you can feel free to. Thank you very much for coming out, everybody, and I hope you got something out of it. I hope you'll take that and think through it and read and come down on what your own position is on these things. So thanks again for being here, and thanks, Steve. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you very much.